Good morning. We'll get started with Martus change requests today. So as we get started with Martus change requests, here's the agenda we'll be working through. A brief overview of some of the tribe's policies on budget mods, what the approval workflow looks like in Martus, the different types of budgets we use, our menu options and how we navigate the change request, and then actually going through a Martus change request and the process and best practices that can help with a successful proposal. Adding new account lines, and then at the end we'll go through the questions that were submitted through the registration forms. So all the policies we refer to is going to be in the accounting manual, policies and procedures manual, and there's really just 4 roles identified to be involved in change requests. And so we have the personnel who prepares the budget. They'll prepare the budget modification, attach documentation supporting the proposal. A program monitor is going to review for accuracy and reasonableness, ensuring adequate supporting documentation, and that it meets any federal or state funding agency guidelines. The finance officer reviews for accuracy and reasonableness, ensuring that sufficient revenue sources are available to fund the budget, and verifying the total amount of the budget mod, and if necessary, requiring Budget and Finance Committee approval before the mod can go further. And then lastly, we have the chief accountant or bookkeeper. They also verify for reasonableness of the date and general ledger period, verify account numbers being used, that the accounts we're trying to use are the appropriate ones, and then they add any newly budgeted account numbers to Intact for accessibility, and once they approve, they post the budget to Intact. A little note on the finance officer and the Budget and Finance Committee approval. The finance officer may be able to give final approval to the modification in the following situations. If the funds are being moved from one line item to another when the amount being moved is lower than either the 10% of the total budget or $10,000. So in other words, the total budget is not being changed, we're just modifying money from one line item to another. And the same rule applies to anything if we're creating a new line item. The finance officer may be able to give final approval if a new line item is being created and the amounts being moved is below either 10% of the total budget or $10,000. And again, in this situation, the total budget does not change. It's just moving money from between line items. Here's the workflow or the approval workflow in Martus. And we'll look at that actually inside of Martus. The very first thing is the worksheet approver, and that's typically the program director assigned to approve for the worksheet, meaning the checkbook and program. They're the first level approver. Our next level, once the program director or worksheet approver approves, is a level 1, and this is Frida who approves, and Lynette's her backup, and it requires just one of those people to approve. Once they approve, it moves on to the program monitor level, which can be one of these 7 individuals. And then the final approval goes to Lori, who's the bookkeeper. Her approval is what would result in your modification being posted. And with this, a worksheet approver, when they approve, has no change to the budget. Neither at the level 1, level 2 budget approvals. None of those affect our budget until all 3 of those, and then the accountant approves the budget. And we go through the budget types before we get into Martus. General fund is one of the budget types we use. It's funded directly by the tribe. There's no carryover for funding sources. New proposals are prepared by programs. General fund budgets use the fiscal year series of financial reports. You can use an Intact budget comparison report to provide or see historical budgetary information. And the funding source numbers remain the same year over year. Indirect cost is another budget type. There's no carryover for budgeted funding sources. There's new proposals prepared by programs each year. They also use the fiscal series of financial reports. Their funding sources remain the same each year. So if you're using indirect cost funds, where you'd expect to see the fiscal year printout as your supporting documentation during the budget mod. If you're funded by the casino, basically the same thing. There's no carryover. They use the fiscal year series of financial reports. Their funding sources remain the same each year. Now we get into a little bit different. Federal and state grants, typically funded by an award through an application and award process. Carryover is determined based on grant conditions. The award length is determined by the grant as well. General, casino, and direct all operate 1 year to 1 year. Our federal and state grants may operate through multiple years. Because of that, we may use different financial reports for supporting our change requests. Single year grants are just going to use the fiscal year grant as long as that grant runs within the tribe's fiscal year. Multi-year grants can use the life to date series of reports because it's going to span through multiple periods of time. And then single year grants that are granted extensions and are going to operate longer than the period of time they originally approved for, they would change to using the life to date reports if they go beyond a fiscal year and being allowed to spend their money. $638 contracts, similar to federal grants. There's no carryover for budgeted funding sources. The budget just continues every year it's permissible to spend. So this can result in budgets existing in the prior funding year. New proposals are prepared by programs based on anticipated contract awards and working through communication with SRD or the health administrator. Their budgets are not entered into the system. They're adjusted to match when the continuing resolutions to fund the actual award is done. These contracts use the life to date reports because they will span multiple years. And funding sources change with each new contract. And then finally, revenue funds. Funded by the receipt of revenue produced by the activities of the funding source. Carryover is processed. So unlike all these other ones, we are going to do a carryover activity each fiscal year. New proposals are prepared by programs and they will use the fiscal year series of financial reports, and their funding sources remain the same each year. So just as a summary of this, General Indirect Casino uses fiscal year 22 now for their change requests. 638 is going to use the fiscal year that's the base year of the funds when they started. Same with federal, state, and grant awards. And then revenue funds use fiscal year 22. So in Martus, you'll have 3 options under Planner: Summary, Worksheets, Change Requests. The Summary is a place where you can get some budgetary information reports for you to use, which is fine for budget, but not necessarily for expenses, as Martus doesn't include our encumbrances and is typically at least a month behind on actual expenses. So just use it for your budgets. Worksheets, it's where we go to prepare our annual proposals. But other than that, for change requests, has nothing to do with what we'll cover today. And then finally, the change request menu, which is where we'll use to submit modifications, review our drafts, find historical changes that we've made, or if we're approvers, that's where we're going to approve the request. So in Martus, we can open the Planner menu here, and we would travel there by finding change requests. Now, when we click on the change request screen, as I did here, and it's loaded the stuff for fiscal year 22, what you can see will depend on your level of access. So I can see everybody's drafts, all the prior entries that were declined, stuff that's been submitted. So if your program has active information, you're going to have, if something's been submitted, you can see that on your screen. Your drafts you're going to see on screen, so you can address those if you need to, or delete them if they're no longer useful. And on this screen, we can also use these boxes to filter. These boxes do not start our change request. They're simply to filter the information about our change requests. For example, we can see this long list of stuff that's here on my screen. If I wanted to limit the screen to only those transactions that are currently submitted, I have a status button here, and I can change that to submitted and click filter. So once Martus is done loading this new option I've selected, it will remove the denieds and the drafts and only show us the stuff that's currently proposed or currently in the submission phase waiting approval for everybody. And that's all these boxes here are for us to filter information on screen. It's not going to set us up to start a change request. This is just giving us information about what's currently happening. We can look at completed ones if we wanted to know change requests we've done this year or other periods of time. You can change this to completed, hit filter, and see the stuff that has been completed for your program. You can change the checkbook you're running for what's been completed or submitted, program if you have multiple programs, or you can choose a funding source. So different options for you to access information within Martus about your program, and more specifically about the change requests your program has developed. So if we get back into the slide deck, we're going to talk about planning our change requests. Probably the most important thing to make sure it's efficient and effective, right? At our base level, we're going to be identifying the funding source and checkbook before we start a change request. We do need to know where we're working. We're going to review pertinent financial reports in Intact. If we're going to modify one budget line and reduce it to move money to another line, we need to know that there's actually funds available to cover that change. Do we have any copies of our committee or council motions or resolutions that are needed to support our as supporting documents for our change requests? Do we have tribal budget and finance committee approval if it's needed? If there's federal, state agency, funding agency authorization needed, do we have those included to submit with our change request? We want to have all of these things in order before we even prepare our change request. So the first thing we're going to do is review our financial report. So I have an example here on screen, and Eleanor's here. Eleanor, we're using IT's revenue funds today. So I have a screenshot of what their financial report looked like yesterday. So we have the financial report in front of us. We want to make sure we make a digital copy of the report. So if we go into Intact, we go to our report center, we find that fiscal year report we want to run. So the IT revenue funds use both revenue and expenses. So I'm going with the fiscal year revenue and expense one funding source view. And I'm going to export this report as a PDF. Why do we run it twice? Instead, we can run it the one time and get it as a PDF and can save it immediately that way. So now we'll have a digital copy once that's done running. If we have life-to-date reports, we know now at this point, as long as we've had Intact, those reports either are going to take a long time to run or can time out while they're running. So rather than running it on your workstation, if you have a life-to-date report, find the one you want to use, and under More Actions, choose Process and Store. And just like running a report, we're going to tell it a checkbook, program, the funding source we want. I'm running the report today, so I have the date today. You can use tomorrow or a different day if you wanted a report to run for you at a later time. As of today for the report, so it's current information. And what format do we want to run it in? You're probably going to choose printable. And then we can click OK. The report's going to be processed offline and not on your computer, so we don't have to sit here and wait for that report to finish running or to hope that it runs. We'll check stored reports to see the report results, and in your user preferences, if you don't have it enabled, you can enable getting notified by email once the report's available. And here for stored reports is where you would see what's happening. So here's the report I just processed and stored. It's currently in process. In a few minutes here, I'll get an email when it's available, and then I can download the report. But those are our basic two options that we need to download one of our financial reports. Here's the IT report that I exported as PDF, so it's ready to go. If you're using Chrome, it allows you to print to PDF. So you can save it to your desktop without printing and scanning. So now we have our financial report. First area we're going to focus on in this report is the available balance column. It's determined by subtracting the budget minus your encumbrances minus the fiscal year to date or life to date, depending on the report. That gives us our available balances. But the column can have two meanings depending on the type of account we're reviewing. First, we'll look at revenue. All revenue accounts start with a 4. So when we're looking at our financial reports, we see an account number starts with a 4. We know that it's a revenue account. Also, if we're running a revenue and expense report, it has the heading that says revenue GL account. In revenue accounts, a debit balance, a positive number, indicates the budget exceeds actual revenue collected, which wouldn't be a good thing. In most cases, means we've budgeted more money than we've received. A credit balance, a negative number, indicates the budget is less than actual revenue. In this case, we've happened to see an account where the budget totals the amount of money we've collected. So the available balance is none. If we were Eleanor and we're looking to budget our revenue for IT, there is no available revenue to budget. So if we were looking to make a budget modification, this is our indicator right here that our next budget mod will not include revenue. And here's a couple of examples of other program reports. So this is the top example here, budget exceeds posted revenue, which we might see for federal grants. The budget is $51,000. To date, we've drawn down $12,750, so the line item is currently over budget by $38,000. This is what it looks like when the revenue posted exceeds the budget. We can see in both lines, a donation item has no budget, but it's had $170 of revenue posted this year. And a donations line item for NAHA has a $1,500 budget. We've posted $4,500 this year. So we have $170 available to budget on the top revenue line and $3,000 available to budget on the donations NAHA line, or a total of $3,170. So if these programs were going to budget, this bottom half certainly has revenue available to be used. This top half does not. So back to our IT example. All of our expense accounts start with a 5 or higher. So if we see those numbers, 5 or higher, we know it's an expense account. It's also got the header expense GL accounts on our reports. In this case, it's a little bit different. Debit balances, positive numbers, indicate the budget exceeds actual expenses. Kind of a good thing if we're looking to see where we stand fiscally. So we can see on their report, the utilities line item has a $5,900 budget. And so this report is subtracting the $1,100 encumbrance and the expenses so far for the year to tell us that there's $2,700 available to spend from the utility line. A credit balance or a negative number for expenses tells us that the budget is less than actual expenses, meaning we've spent more than we've budgeted. And we can see on screen we have one negative line item. Our vehicle equipment maintenance supply line does not currently have a budget, but does have accrued expenses for the year, putting that line item over budget by $482.92. So for our example today, this is what we'll be working through to correct. So we do need to make sure that that line item is appropriately budgeted to prevent overspending. If we don't address this over budget line and we continue spending throughout the year, it's $482, but if we spent that money in another line and we end the year over budget and not enough funds, we're having to go to budget and finance and ask for additional funds to cover our spending. And so the most common area we typically see that in is in our employee line items, since we don't have to request purchase orders for employees. Those come in as journal entries from Workforce Go. And so I think a lot of it's the fringe cost, your health insurances, dental vision, that stuff. We need to make sure we're addressing each pay period as new payroll is posted, making sure we're staying within our budget. So what supporting documentation are we going to need for this budget mod? This is a quote from the accounting manual. Personnel responsible for initiating, changing, adding, or deleting budgets within the computer system would attach any related documentation approving the change, including approved budgets or budget modifications. Is there tribal budget and finance committee approval needed? We went over that at the beginning of this, what that meant for the finance officer and what their role is. Do we have any copies of committee or council motions or resolutions supporting the proposed change? And if there's federal or state funding agency authorization needed, do we have those documents included, including pre-authorization if it's necessary, and the documentation of the agency approval included with our budget modification? So we need to take that into consideration if we're modifying those type of funds. So we want to submit a change request to eliminate the negative line item. Are there any approvals needed before our submission today? That's a $482 budget mod we're looking at. So we know by looking through this, it's not going to need budget and finance approval. This doesn't exceed $10,000 or 10% of that total budget. Are the funds subject to any rules by a funding agency? This is IT's revenue budget. This is not any grant award through any area. So no rules apply from a funding agency. So we don't need documentation from there. What line item or line items have enough funds to cover the proposed correction? We have a $482 shortfall on our budget. Can we use dues and subscriptions to cover the $482? The answer is no. It's $181 available there. If we were going to deplete that line item, we have a maximum of $181 we could reduce this budget by, meaning we would need a second line item to cover the $482. So on the face of this, we certainly see 4 other line items that certainly have enough funds available to be reduced to cover the $482 shortfall. So if we're planning our budget mod out, we know, here's the summary of what it looks like in intact. That line has a $0 budget with available negative amount. We're going to use the utility line for this one, which has a $5,900 budget with $2,700 available. In Martus, how are we going to make that look? We're going to change the current budget of $0 for that line to $482, and our utility line item is going to go from $5,900, and we're going to reduce that to $5,400. So that's our game plan for today. We have our printout that we need to include as an attachment. We know the line items we can use. We know the program checkbook funding source we're going to use. And we know that we're working within the current fiscal year. So now we're ready to get into Martus. So to start our new change request, there's a blue button that says create new change request. That's where we're going. On this screen, when we use these for filters, none of this makes any difference to what's going to happen when we click create new change request. No matter what checkbook, program, or funding source we use, that's not going to affect what's going to pop up in the create new change request. The one item that can affect that is the fiscal year. So if we were working on a budget that's entered in a prior year, we would certainly need to change the year and then click filter to make sure that fiscal year loads before we move on to a change request. So we're going to click create new change request. It's going to take us first to the summary screen for our change request, which for the first time, it's going to be blank because we haven't added anything yet. But there's some indicators here for us that we need to keep note of, which is number 1, that fiscal year. If you're working through your insurance or your ambulance funds from IHS, and that's from a different base year, we'd expect to see that year changed here, so we know we're in the right screen and that the budget we're expecting to work through would be shown. If you're not sure which fiscal year to use, one of the easiest ways to make that determination is to go into the report center and find a report called Intact Budget Comparison. So if we needed to know which fiscal year our budget is entered, we can enter our program, our checkbook, and our funding source. And when we click OK, it's going to run and it's going to give us what the budget is that exists for the program. So we can see here, granted this is a test one that I use, which fiscal year has a budget. And so for your funds, you're likely going to see one column telling you which fiscal year. So fiscal year 19, for example, we would know if I go and filter in Martus to fiscal year 19, I would find this travel budget for $100. I'd find this office supply budget for $100. So for your grants, your contracts, you run that report with your funding source, you're going to get the fiscal year your budget exists in. So when you get back into Martus, you know where to go. All right, so back to our IT budget mod. We're ready to start a new line. So let's click the blue add button now to work on one of these items. We're going to now have to select a worksheet we're going to use to work through. Depending on your access, we'll determine what your list is. So I'm going to filter this to ITs so we can go from there. So the typical IT employee is going to see something like this on their screen. We're using their revenue worksheet. So here we are with the checkbook and program combination. And what we're going to see on screen is the current budget information. So what we know from our financial report is that account line 69300 does not have a budget. So 69300 is not shown here on screen. So our responsibility is going to be to add this line to our worksheet. Below our budget information is a drop box for account and funding source. So we're typing the account number and selecting that to populate the account drop box. And now we need to find our funding source, which if you're not sure, it's listed right above. So type their account or their funding source number here. Have that selected, so the account and the funding source. Now I can click add. Before I do, I want to point out there is a drop down box for account number and funding source here. This isn't where we're going to go to add a new line. This is a filter box. So if you come here and you have a lot of funds, you know, like if you have several different contracts through IHS, or you have multiple funding sources if you're EPA, whoever you are, you can use the filter to reduce that to just the one funding source if that's what you want to see and work on. So you don't have to see the other items in your budgets that's not important at the time. So you can use that to filter. So we've got our account number and our funding source. I click add. Now we can modify this budget. What is the amount of the budget that we need to include? $482.92. Typically, the budget's going to be entered in the October of whatever fiscal year we're working on. So easy budget change. We're going from $0 to $482.92. We have that entered. We're ready to go. We can see here the worksheet, the account number and funding source are entered. We have all the information we need now. I can save. And now our summary sheet has information entered. If we leave it at just this line item, the net change is an amount other than 0. It tells us that the request isn't balanced yet. So we do need something to offset increasing our expenses. We've made that determination from the financial report. There isn't revenue available. The available balance is 0. That we're going to use the utility line item. So we're going to click add. Here's utilities. And we have two options here to make this change. Take out your calculator and figure out $5,955 minus the 482, and then type that difference into the revised line. We can also change an adjustment to say an additional amount. And if I put the negative 482.92, you can see that here on the side, it's a little grayed out, but you can still see the amount here if you forget what the amount is. So if I enter that and click preview, this revised line automatically adjusts the budget now to be the current amount minus the amount I'm wanting to make the change for. So now we have the new budget total entered in our revised line the amount we want to propose that the new budget's going to be for this line item. So if we're happy with what that is, we can save this line. And now we can see the work we've done so far. We're proposing to add a new line and moving the budget from not budgeted before to $482. And to offset that expense increase, we're going to decrease an expense line for utilities. The net change is 0, so we're looking good. Our budget mod balances. We can include a change request explanation here, what it is we're doing if more explanation is needed. I know that monitors are now asking that in this box we include the funding source, which helps them on that filter screen so they can more easily see the mods they have to approve and not have to dig into ones that don't require their attention. They get an email for every single request rather than just their own, since they're all lumped together in that one approval role. And we can add any other explanation we need if it's necessary. We're going to upload our attachments. Here's the PDF I had saved. So we're adding that. If you have other documents that were needed, if it's Budget and Finance Committee approval, if it's council approval for a new grant, if it's funding agency approval, whatever that is, for our change request, we can only have one upload file at a time. So that means you're going to have to combine all those documents into one file that you can upload into one PDF. If I tried to add another document, so we note this here, the 1345 IT revenue. If this workers' comp guidebook was a new attachment we needed for this, when I add that, it removes the first document and now it's just that one. So you'd have to make sure it's one ongoing document for all the stuff you need for supporting documentation. And then once we're ready to approve, we can hit submit for approval. Or if we're not ready to send it yet, we could hit save. So all of our work is saved for us to come back to and edit. And if we hit submit for approval and you're the person who also approves your budget mods, you will get an email from Martus asking you to approve because it doesn't auto approve for you, even if you're the approver and the preparer of the mod. So once you hit submit, you would have to come back into the flow and get your approval to move on to the next step. Now, if we had made an error and it wasn't the utility line item we wanted to use, and we need to address that, we can edit this current line and we would have to delete it. So now that goes away, and now we can add a new line to include if it was going to be telephone and fax. And make the adjustment the same way. Entering the amount that we're going to reduce the budget by, or positive number if you want to increase that budget line. Hit preview so the action takes place. And then we can save that line. So that's how we can amend or change our lines. All right. So no questions coming in. So I'm going to move on to the questions that were submitted on the request forms or the registration forms. Basically, these two questions, not knowing which accounts we can move funds from. So hopefully the overview of our revenue and expense helps with that, identifying or knowing what the available balances mean for those two lines. That's what we're looking for. A program monitor that's going to review this mod is going to look to make sure if we're reducing this budget to $5,800, is that enough on the telephone fax line that if we did that, are their current expenses covered? So we can see it certainly is. There'd still be a couple $100 available to spend after that budget mod is approved. So that gets us where we need to go there. And then determining what year to do the budget mod in. Use this budget comparison report to get you wherever it is you need to go, to tell you which fiscal year your funds exist in. And from here we can see FY20 is when this budget exist. So if they were going to make any changes to these 3 line items in Martus, they would have to go to FY20. And so that's how we determine which year to do our budget mod in. Unless you're general indirect casino or revenue funds, you're always working pretty much within the current fiscal year. All right, well, I don't see any questions. So that's all I have for the presentation today. Thank you everybody for your time. Enjoy the rest of the day.